Hi everybody, it's Nancy Scott with Masterpiece Quilting. Welcome to the Designer Tips and Techniques virtual show. I'm going to refresh my laptop here real quick to make sure the feed is coming through before I get started. There we go. It's always good when you can see yourself. Yep. Notification is up. I am live. Excellent. Let me scoot this a little bit out of the way. That way I can keep track of what's happening on screen while I'm talking to you guys. I just heard the clock upstairs chime right at 2 o'clock. I thought I might be a minute or two early. Do you guys ever get it where every clock around you has a different time? One computer's on one time, my phone was on a different one. This one, the clock on the wall, it's like, okay, is it 2 o'clock? Is it 2:01? Is it 1:59? But hey, thank you so much for joining me and being a part of our Designer Tips and Techniques virtual show. As I mentioned, I'm Nancy Scott with Masterpiece Quilting, and welcome. Today I am going to talk about one of the things that we need to do to make sure that our job as a quilter is easy. Hey, we all like easy, don't we? We love it when a quilt top comes together perfectly. I found that there are 3 keys to getting a quilt top to come together, or any piecing that you're doing coming together very, very easily. Accurate cutting of all the pieces, precise piecing of them, and then proper pressing. If we achieve all 3 of those, cutting, piecing, and pressing, then those quilt tops come together so much easier. So today I want to focus on accurate cutting, because if our fabric is not cut correctly and to the correct size, it's really difficult to make it fit together as we're piecing it. So let's talk about cutting a little bit. Now I'm going to scoot my notes over there, that way I can see them, so I don't forget anything, but they're not right in front of me. Couple components go into cutting. One of them has to do with our cutters, and not so much the style, whether it be kind of the pistol grip here where we have an automatically retractable cover, or whether it be this is my funky zebra one, where we're sliding it manually. But what's more important is this guy right here, that blade, and the blade needs to be sharp. And I'm going to be as guilty as anybody for not wanting to change out my blades. Oh, I can cut a little bit more with them. So I was just cutting with this one. If your cuts are like this, where you kind of have to help them apart, like that, and you got little pieces of thread holding on, and you're kind of having to press really hard, and you're still getting that, that is a sure sign that your cutting blade needs to be replaced. I tend to buy the multi-packs, and I just keep them on hand. I'm down to 1, so that means it's time to reorder. When you're cutting, and I just replaced this blade because, you know what, I'll be honest, both of my cutters were cutting like this. But we don't want to have to really use a whole lot of arm pressure to cut. We just want to be able to glide through and get nice cuts. And you know what? Every time that I change my cutter, I'm like, wow, why didn't I do that sooner? But it does make so much of a difference as you're getting older. Hands aren't aching at the end of the day if you've been cutting all day, and the cuts are nice, even, accurate. None of those jaggy threads hanging on. So that is the first tip, is that we need a sharp cutter in order to get accurate cuts. Scoot those out of the way here real quick. Next, something that we don't talk about a lot, it's our cutting mats. The cutting mat is just as critical to cutting as what the cutting blade is. And I'm going to flip this guy around here a little bit, and I think you're going to be able to see it. I cut a lot of fat quarters because that's what I'm selling in my Etsy shop right now. So 18-inch This guy has got a big old groove in it. If your cutting mat is starting to get grooves in it on the popular cut lines, which is normally 18 inches for the half yard, if you're cutting 2.5-inch strips, my 2.5 inch is looking a little rough over there. One of the things that you can do is flip it over and use the back side, and depending on which style you've got, they may be printed on both sides, and as you're going to notice, the back side is actually even worse than the reverse side on this one right here at the 18-inch. But even though they're called self-healing cutting mats, after a while you're going to get grooves in it. And you know what? If you're running with a dull blade, you're going to get even more grooves in it. One of the things that you can do is reposition your mat so that you're cutting in an area that you haven't used as much. One of the corner areas out here. Something else that you can do if you're cutting an 18-inch cut, doesn't mean that you have to start at 1 and cut at 18. You can start at 10 and cut at 28, and you're still making an 18-inch cut. So you can jockey some things around on your cutting mat. Some mats are two-sided where they're printed on both sides. Other ones have no printing on the back. And if you're using a template grid, you know what? Just flip it over and cut on that side that doesn't have any markings. That is perfectly okay too. So we want to make sure that we've got a good cutting grid, or excuse me, cutting mat that we're working with. And I'll be honest with you, there comes a time when they just have too many grooves in them, and that's when it's time to replace them. It happens. I end up replacing, I think I've got four cutting mats here in the studio. I'm replacing probably one of them a year just because I'm cutting that much and they do get wore out. Now, let's talk about cutting grids. Having the right tool for the right job. We've got cutting grids in a variety of sizes. This is my long 2.5-inch by 36.5-inch. So it is letting me span the entire length of my cutting mat, and I like that. It's actually longer than my reach, but that's okay. One of the key things is making sure that your grid is the size that works well for you. I'm going to be honest, I have very small hands. This is my favorite, the 6.5 by 12.5, and it works good. I can get good pressure on this to make sure that it doesn't slip. And slipping is one of those things that is very important with our cutting grid. There's nothing more frustrating nor more hazardous than if we're cutting along and our fingers are in the cut zone because either the cutting grid has slipped or our hand has slipped on the cutting grid. Many of the cutting grids come with a non-skid surface on the back of them. And I don't want to get into brand specifics because I'm not advocating one brand over another one, but this one does happen to be a Creative Grids, and it has little non-slip, surfaces already on the back of it. And that's super handy to keep it from sliding across your fabric. I never realized how much I was relying on those until I grabbed a cutting grid that did not have them, and there we went, as soon as I put some pressure onto it. So the short one that I use all the time, this guy has them, as does this one. I'll be honest, sometimes it's hard to see the markings on those. That's why I don't want to get into different brands or talk about that, because that's a personal preference thing, and that's a thing with my eyesight. OmniGrid has their lines printed in yellow, and different companies will print in different colors. So this one's an easy quilting, and it has some blue lines on it. But on this particular one with the yellow lines printed on the back of it, you can feel the yellow is what's being the gripper. So we can use that as the grip against the fabric. Again, same way with this one, you can feel on the back side how the printing is a little bit raised, and that helps grip. Sometimes you will run across, I like using little specialty rulers. If we're cutting certain shapes, instead of using a paper template to draw around or a cardboard template, it's easy to pick up the plastic grid that corresponds with that shape. On this particular one, because we've got a curve on it and I'm going to be cutting a curve with a rotary cutter, I've got to make sure that I've got a lot of pressure on that, and it's really easy for it to slip. Something that you can do to make sure that your grids aren't slipping is to actually put a little bit of a grip on the back of it. And they do sell some different products designed specifically for quiltings, but I'm going to give you my hack right now for doing that. Head to your local hardware store or any place that they sell sandpaper, and you're going to find stick-on sanding discs. This one particularly goes on a palm sander, but the key here is stick-on. That's what you're looking for, because these guys have adhesive on the back of them. And I'm just going to pop up the paper here. I'm going to expose that adhesive, and I can just stick that to the back of my cutting grid. And I've got 2 on there for right now. I'd probably put a third one kind of over here just to lock that in. And let me grab some fabric real quick. That really holds that fabric. I mean, I'm pushing on it and the fabric is moving, but the ruler is not moving against the fabric, and that's what we want. Go with a medium. That's what I use as far as the grittiness of the sandpaper, so that way we're not tearing up the fabric. But that will let you to position, let that sandpaper hold that cutting grid in place, and then you can cut around those specific template shapes. So cutting grids, those are extremely important to get accurate cuts. Now, let me talk a little bit about the fabric itself, because the fabric itself influences your ability to cut it. I've got just a remnant piece off of a bolt here, and we can line that up. And I'm not lining up based on the mat right now. I'm lining up using the cutting grid. So if I'm cutting a 2.5 inch strip, for instance, for binding, lined up there. Let me grab the sharp cutter. Positioning. And coming across. Now, as I would keep cutting strips and getting over to this bit of a bolt end that's got some wrinkles in it, and as you all know, those are some good hard creases if they've been on the bolt. Many times it's worthwhile to do some pressing in advance of our cutting. And I'm going to bring my cutting, or excuse me, my pressing mat over here. And just give that a very quick press to release those wrinkles so that we're not cutting through the wrinkles. Depending on the fabric and how you're going to be cutting, you may want to use starch alternative or starch, either one, whatever your personal preference is. Not super, super heavy, but give it some extra body, particularly if you've pre-washed your fabrics and they're starting to be a little soft as you're working with them. It's really good sometimes to give them a quick press before you cut. And also as we're cutting our shapes, particularly when we're working with templates. Grab. Get this scooted out of the way. I've got a pre-cut square here, 5-inch. If you can find a ruler that's designed specifically for cutting pre-cuts, many times those pinked edges can throw us off just a little bit. So if we've got one that's designed or sized correctly just for that, it makes it really easy to line up to increase our cutting accuracy on pre-cuts. Those little pinked edges, every single one of them is unique from each company, and sometimes even within the companies, as far as how much they factor into that measurement. And the final thing that I want to talk about real quickly is if we're cutting on the bias. I realize we are right at 2:15, so give me just an extra minute here. I'm going to press this little piece of fabric real quick. We've got our straight line here, and scoot a couple things over. Going to be cutting using the triangle shape. If we line this up so that we have one edge on the straight line, think about it, when we cut this one, it's going to be on the bias. So we'll have one straight, one bias. If we're cutting and lining up this way, we've got two cuts that are on the bias. So think about how you're going to be cutting as you're putting something together. Do you need bias edges because you're going to be piecing curves and you want to be able to do that little bit of stretch that the bias is going to give you? Or do you need for your edges to be on straight grain, and is that important? So another thing for you to think about as you're using cutting grids and cutting tools. But cut accurately, it's worth that extra little bit of time. If it says 2 7/8 in your pattern, preferably cut 2 7/8. Don't round up to 3 inches unless you're planning on trimming everything to size afterwards. But we'll talk more about that the next time I talk about piecing and then also pressing. So again, I'm Nancy Scott with Masterpiece Quilting. Thank you so much for joining me as part of this Designer Tips and Techniques virtual show. And at 4 o'clock this afternoon, you need to tune back in with Sue Griffiths, who is on Duck Creek Mountain Quilting page. So she'll be our next presenter, and I know that she will have an amazing presentation just like all of the designers do. Thank you so much for being a part of this show, and I will see you soon. Bye.